We are in Acts chapter 27 and 28. Acts 27 and 28. Trusting God in the storms of life. Before we go, you've got a pop quiz. For those of you who have books, we've already given out all the books, but if you have a book, you can actually fill it out. If you don't have a book, you can answer it in your mind. Here we go. Pop quiz. How likely are you to trust people in general? No, how likely are you to trust people in general? In general. Are you trusting of people? Do you trust people? Okay, here's a question. Do you trust all people? That's where we get into circumstances and all that kind of stuff, okay? How likely are you to trust people in general? How likely are you to trust God in the varying circumstances of your life? Okay, it's higher than the people. Just think about that. Think about that. Where are you? Where are you in that spectrum? Because trust is something that if you try to live without it completely, it can be devastating. It's a terrible world to live in without trust. Terrible world to live in. Believe me, I've seen it, and it's frightening. So, do you trust God in the storms of life, even when your life is shipwrecked? It's easy to trust God when things are going well. Oh yeah, God and me. Yeah, we are simpatico. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It's quite a different story to trust God when things are going, how shall we say, not so well. Yeah. To give you an example. To give you an example. Again, I'm going to use T. He called us up Friday night. He called us up Friday night. What was going on late in the evening around 9 or 10 o'clock Friday night? What? A storm. A literal storm. A literal storm. Dee lives in College Station. He wanted to know what he needed to do to take precautions for the storm that was coming. Do I need to put my car someplace safe? He has a really nice car, and do I need to put my car? I said, if you can, but the odds are nothing's going to happen. The odds are that it's going to be okay. Now this was about 7 o'clock in the evening, before we knew that the storms were actually starting to dissipate, kind of fizzle a little bit. But he said, should I find some place to be? Yeah. You might want to just, stay close to home. Don't go out running around like you do on a normal Friday night. Stay close to home. But I told him all of that. But his response was still, and we told him, we'll be praying for you. He said, I hope you will. I hope it all works out. His response was still one of, you ain't too sure because there's a storm coming. You understand what I'm saying? I mean, that's the way it was. Okay? So we have to trust Him in the storms of life. In addition to the storms that come. God calls on His people to trust His promises without wavering, and to call on others to trust into them as well in those promises. The points we're going to be discussing today are trust in God and boldly proclaim His truth, encourage others to trust in God, and recognize the fulfillment of what God has promised. Before we get going, we have to have a wee bit of background. We're in Acts 27, we are. And the wee bit of background is this. Travel by sea had its downside. Travel by sea was not always the most harmonious. Paul himself knew this in 2 Corinthians 11:25. He says 3 times he was shipwrecked. 3 times he was shipwrecked. That was a couple of years before Acts 27. Okay? And he's fixing to hit the shipwreck of his life. Not just a shipwreck. It says that he spent a day and a night floating in the sea. Think about that. Paul knows what sea travel is all about, and yet he got back on the boat. Okay? And a couple other things. Look at Acts 27:14. when you look at that, there's a couple of terms in there that I want you to be familiar with because I want you to realize the seriousness of what they were facing. Okay? The first one is usually translated violent wind or a terrible wind. Sometimes it's translated a typhoon-like wind because of the Greek. Because the Greek is anemos tuphonikos. Okay? Tuphonikos, does that look like typhoon to you? Where we get our word typhoon? Whether it looks like it or not.
I have a northeaster.
Yeah, well, that's the next word. Euroklodon. Euroklodon. Now, you might notice that that's capitalized. It's because that was the name of the storm. And it was actually, this is kind of interesting to me, it's not to you, but I'm going to share it anyway because I think it's interesting. It's actually kind of a nautical term. It means from the northeast to the north. From the northeast to the north. Kind of in there somewhere. Kind of like we would say north-northeast. Okay? Pilot there pays attention to wind directions. Have you ever heard of a Euroclydon? No, I didn't think you would. Hey, Captain, we got us a Euroclydon coming. Okay. No, it was a violent wind. This is a storm. I grew up hearing the term nor'easter. And I knew when my dad said, we got a nor'easter blowing in, I had to batten down the hatches. Because it was going to be something serious. It's something serious. So it's a nor'easter. You can say northeaster if you wish, but to me it's a nor'easter. Got it? And another bit, the Egyptian grain ship carrying Paul was probably at least 150 feet long and 35 feet wide, if not larger. That's a freighter, baby. That's a big ship. This room is 20 by 20. Okay? So it would be 1.5 times the width of this room. Think about that. And it would go from here out to about where that bulldozer's sitting. Maybe even a little bit farther. Just think about that.
Quite a rowboat there.
That is quite a rowboat. We usually picture Paul being on this little ship where there are 4 or 5 people on deck, right? No, this is a grain ship. And it could have carried anywhere from 500 to 1,200 tons of grain. What? That's a lot of grain. That's a lot of grain. And what they did was they shipped grain from Egypt up to Italy. And sometimes they had to go around the coast, especially at this time of the year, okay, which is late fall, early winter. And so they had to go around the coast to be able to make the trip. The trip back was easy. Wind was at their backs, and hoist the sails and just let her rip. Okay. On board this ship, there were 276 people. Now, does that give you an idea about the size of the ship? In addition to a carload of grain. A cargo of grain. Okay? Now, I'm going to do something that I haven't done. Can you see that at all from the back? Can you read some of the bigger words? Can you see the red line at the back? If not, we can switch off the lights. Oh, it's okay? Okay. I'm going to read Acts 27 and the first few verses of Acts 28. I'm going to read them. You don't need to follow along in your Bible, okay? You can have your Bibles open and glance down every now and then if you want to. If you want to follow along, that's fine. But I want you to follow the map. Does that make sense? Follow the map, and you will hear some of these places, and you'll see, oh, okay, that's where that is. And just follow it across. Fair enough? Here we go. By the way, I'm reading this out of the Green Monster. That's what we used to call the Living Bible. It's not the New Living Translation, it's the Living Bible. And it was called the Green Monster because it was heretical when it first came out. It's not now, but it was there. Okay, here we go. Acts 27. You know that Paul has appealed to Rome, and so the last thing he heard was, okay, to Rome you will go. Okay? Arrangements were finally made to start us on our way. By the way, Luke is writing this. Luke wrote the book of Acts. And so when he says us, he's referring to him and the other people. Okay? Arrangements were finally made to start us on our way to Rome by ship. So Paul and several other prisoners were placed in the custody of an officer named Julius, a centurion, a member of the imperial guard. We left on a boat which was scheduled to make several stops along the Turkish coast. I should add that Aristarchus, a Greek from Thessalonica, was with us. The next day, when we docked at Sidon, Julius was very kind to Paul and let him go ashore to visit with friends and receive their hospitality. Putting to sea from there, we encountered headwinds, and it made it difficult to keep the ship on course, so we sailed north of Cyprus between the island and the mainland and passed along the coast of the provinces of Cilicia and Pamphylia, landing in Myra, in the province of Lycia. There our officer found an Egyptian ship from Alexandria bound for Italy and put us aboard. We had several days of rough sailing and finally neared Cnidus, but the winds had yet become so strong that we ran across to Crete, passing the port of Salome, beating into the wind with great difficulty and moving slowly along the southern coast of Crete. We arrived at Fair Havens near the city of Lasea. There we stayed for several days. The weather was becoming dangerous for long voyages by then because it was late in the year and after the fall festival. And Paul spoke to the ship's officers about it. Sirs, he said, I believe there's trouble ahead if we go on. Perhaps shipwreck, loss of cargo, injuries, and death. And by the way, Paul knows shipwrecks. But the officers in charge of the prisoners listened more to the ship's captain and the owner of the ship than to Paul. And since Fair Havens was an exposed harbor, a poor place to spend the winter, most of the crew advised trying to go further up the coast to Phoenix in order to winter there. Phoenix was a good harbor with only a northwest and southwest exposure. Just then, a light wind began blowing from the south, and it looked like a perfect day for the trip. So they pulled up anchor and sailed along the coast to shore. But shortly afterwards, the weather changed abruptly, and a heavy wind of typhoon strength, a nor'easter they called it, caught the ship and blew it out to sea. They tried at first to face back to shore, but couldn't, so they gave up and let the ship run before the gale. We finally sailed behind a small island named Claudia, where with great difficulty we hoisted aboard the lifeboat that was towed behind us. Then we banded the ship with ropes to strengthen the hull. The sailors were afraid of being driven across to the quicksands of the African coast, so they lowered the topsails and were thus driven before the wind. The next day, as the seas grew higher, the crew began throwing cargo overboard. The following day, they threw out the tackle and everything else they could lay their hands on. The terrible storm raged unabated many days, until at last all hope was gone. No one had eaten for a long time, but finally, Paul called the crew together and said, Men, you should have listened to me in the first place and not left Fair Havens. You would have avoided all this injury and loss. But cheer up. None of us will lose our lives, even though the ship will go down. For last night, an angel of the God to whom I belong and to whom I serve stood beside me, and he said, Don't be afraid, Paul, for you will surely stand trial before Caesar. What's more, God has granted your request and will save the lives of all those sailing with you. So take courage. I believe God. It will be just as he said. But we will be shipwrecked on an island. About midnight on the 14th night of the storm, as we were being driven to and fro on the Adriatic Sea, the sailors suspected land was near. They sounded and found 120 feet of water below them. A little later, they sounded again and found only 90 feet. At this rate, they knew they would soon be driven ashore, and fearing the rocks along the coast, they threw out 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. Some of the sailors planned to abandon the ship and lowered the emergency boat as though they were going to pull out anchors from the prow. But Paul said to the soldiers and commanding officer, You will die unless everyone stays aboard. So the soldiers cut the ropes and let the boat fall off. As the darkness gave way to the early morning light, Paul begged everyone to eat. You haven't touched food for 2 weeks. Please eat something now for your own good, for not a hair of your head shall perish. Then he took some hardtack and gave thanks to God before them all and broke off a piece and ate it. Suddenly everyone felt better and began eating. All 276 of us, for that is the number we had on board. After eating, the crew lightened the ship further by throwing off all the wheat overboard. When it was day, they didn't recognize the coastline, but noticed a bay with a beach and wondered if they could get between the rocks and be driven up onto the beach. They finally decided to try cutting off the anchors, leaving them in the sea. They lowered the rudders, raised the foresail, and headed ashore, but the ship hit a sandbar and ran aground. The bow of the ship stuck fast, while the stern was exposed to the violence of the waves and began to break apart. The soldiers advised their commanding officer to let them kill the prisoners, lest any of them swim ashore and escape. But Julius wanted to spare Paul, so he told them no. Then he ordered all who could swim to jump overboard and make for land, and the rest to try it on planks and debris from the broken ship. So everyone escaped safely ashore. Chapter 28. We soon learned that we were on the island of Malta. The people of the island were very kind to us, building a bonfire on the beach to welcome and warm us in the rain and cold. As Paul gathered an armful of sticks to lay on the fire, a poisonous snake driven out by the heat fastened itself onto his hand. The people of the island saw it hanging there and said to each other, "A murderer, no doubt. Though he escaped the sea, justice will not permit him to live." But Paul shook the snake off and into the fire and was unharmed. The people waited for him to begin swelling or suddenly fall dead. But when they had waited a long time and no harm came to him, they changed their minds and decided he was a god. Near the shore we landed was an estate belonging to Publius, the governor of the island. He welcomed us courteously and fed us for 3 days. As it happened, Publius' father was ill with fever and dysentery. Paul went in and healed him, laid his hands on him and healed him. Then all the other sick people on the island came and were cured. As a result, we were showered with gifts, and when the time came to sail, people put on board all sorts of things we would need for the trip. I know that's a long story, but isn't it a great story? Wow. Luke done good. When he wrote that out, he did good. So let's talk about it. Now you can look at your Bible. Trust in God and boldly proclaim His truth. By the way, are there any questions that you have about any of the characters, any of the places, any of the peoples, any of the facts of the story? Any questions that popped into your head?
No, but that was helpful to see.
Yeah, that was great.
Good.
The map
I'm
thing.
glad. Okay? Yeah, did you notice in the map how in the Mediterranean it kind of went like that?
What they say it's Paul that's healing him, but what did God give him?
Yeah, God was healing people through Paul, just as He had through all of the apostles. Okay, then let's go on. I want to ask you a question. How did Paul live out the admonition of point 1, which is trust in God and boldly proclaim His truth, and what he said and did in these verses 21 through 24? How did he live it out? How did he demonstrate it?
He showed no fear.
He showed no fear. Amazing, isn't it? I mean, this is a violent storm. This is the storm that scares sailors. You understand? I mean, people who are used to being in storms were scared. Paul's calm. Why?
He had strong faith.
Faith.
He had already been told.
He had already been told.
You're going to go to Rome, so.
You're going to go to Rome.
An angel came to him last night.
Angel came to him. Okay? How did he boldly proclaim this truth?
He was looking ahead, not at the storm right now, but he was looking ahead for after. We need to eat. We need to stay on board. We are going to survive.
Yeah. Now, it's interesting. There's not a discussion as to why they didn't eat for 2 weeks. But they didn't eat for 2 weeks.
They're probably seasick, I'm just saying.
Yeah. Might have been seasick. They might have been just scared to the point where they couldn't. Yes, sir.
He shared as he was going along, you know, God, he was the only one God was speaking to in that situation, the only believer, and he was sharing that with those that were around him as he went about doing what he was doing.
Right. And every time he spoke, what he said had come true. Think about it. Back there when they were fixing to take off, and he said, look, man, I don't think we need to go any further, you know?
But you notice he said in 21, you should have listened to me.
Yeah,
Told you so.
yeah, I thought that was a little bit when I told you so, yeah. Yeah, yeah, just rubbing it in a little. Just, yeah, by the way, did y'all happen to notice that I said you shouldn't have done this? So, Paul is sharing his faith, but he's sharing his faith after living his faith. People listened to what he had to say because they had seen it in what he had done. You understand? You know, they say actions speak louder than words. Paul's actions had already preached a sermon. People were willing to listen to it. Right? Okay? This is kind of along the same lines, but look at verses 30 through 38. The point is encourage others to trust in God. Why did the sailors listen to Paul in verses 30, 32 when he told them to stay on board the ship? They were abandoning ship. Why did they, and I never have understood this either, why did they cut the lifeboat loose?
Take away temptation.
Bob,
What?
in the story, it wasn't the sailors that cut it.
Yeah, it was the officers.
It was officers of the military.
But when you, yeah, you're right.
Two different.
Yeah, you're right.
It shows you the chaos that was going on and how terrified they were and how they were looking for any hope that they could. And Paul had that hope that came from God. So,
I
okay.
mean, sailors are notorious, you know, a superstitious lot, and they were even more so back then.
Yeah.
And they believed in any little, and if he
That's
was
true.
showing any sense of calm, I got this under control, and they're like,
Okay.
Well, you would think that he would have had to foster a little bit of, I don't know, respect from them at this point, because here he's been arrested, he's been in jail, and he's never shied away from speaking his mind and speaking what he believes is the truth, right?
Right.
You think about the majority of prisoners would not be that way. I mean, how would you act if you're in jail? You're going to be cowering and
Right.
scared to speak your mind. So
Right.
he's always
He's
had
very
this
confident.
sense of confidence
That's right.
and peace about him that I would think would make people listen to him.
And where did that come from? From
Well,
God.
from God, obviously.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
But wasn't he told that he would be going to Rome?
Yes.
It's a
Yes.
done deal. It's already happened. I mean, the person that was the calmest in the boat was obviously the weirdest in the boat. Because he had the peace that passes all understanding. I mean, he was
Yeah.
right in the midst of God's will. He didn't have anything to concern with. In
Right.
fact, I dare say, he could have eaten the whole time, but he thought, well, I'm not going to eat either if they're not eating. You know,
Yeah.
it wasn't because he was nervous.
Right.
He was completely peace that passes all understanding. It's a
Right.
demonstration of that.
And right in the middle of the storm.
That-
It shows.
That's the only place the peace that passes all understanding comes.
Okay. Why was he insistent on everyone eating?
Because we didn't want them to die and starve.
Well, they probably wouldn't have starved, but
To keep their strength to
Keep
cross
their strength.
over to go to land and stuff.
yeah.
Because all that water and during the storm was pretty.
He even told them, you're going to need your strength.
And swim meet to go.
Swim meet's coming up, baby. Those of you that can't swim, you're going to learn.
We're not told,
Yeah, swimmers think, what?
we're not told that of any miracle here as it relates to the food, but you have to kind of think, okay, he talks about the bread, but was there enough bread? If they had brought any fruits or things like that, things would have spoiled. Was there some, we're not told that there was a miracle, but could we maybe think that there might have been?
Okay, I want you to go back go back to when they left Fair Havens. They were just headed around the corner to Phoenix. You remember on the map? They never made it to Phoenix. But let's just say it was nothing more than a 3-hour tour. A 3-hour tour. But you're absolutely right. And the point is this. They were anticipating a 2-week journey. They weren't expecting a storm. They weren't expecting any of that. So it is possible. So Paul pulled out some beef jerky and said, let's go. Let's go. Yeah. Okay? Anything else? I'm thinking he was just saying, I personally believe that Paul, before he spoke, always had in his mind what God wanted him to know and to say and to do. And I'm sure God was saying, hey, you need to tell these people to eat. So we ain't out of this yet, and they're going to need their strength. So what does Paul say? You're going to need your strength. You're going to need your strength. Come on, let's eat. Okay? Verses 39 through 34 recognize the fulfillment of what God has promised. That's a good question. Julius, the centurion. By the way, we don't know how many. A centurion usually is in charge of 100 soldiers. Okay? We don't know that he had 100 soldiers on board, but we do know that he had some soldiers on board. They were guarding the prisoners that were being taken to Rome. Okay? Being taken to Rome. So Julius is very nice to Paul. First, at Sidon, he lets him get off and go visit his friends. Okay? He talks to him when they're fixing to set out on the Egyptian ship. He doesn't take his advice, but he does hear him. You know, he hears him out. Right? Now, the soldiers want to kill him. Why do they want to kill him? They're responsible for these prisoners. If they die, that's fine. But if they escape, that ain't no good. Okay? So they want to kill him. So why did Julius want to spare Paul's life? This calls for conjecture. This is not something that's spelled out. Yes?
I think because he knows a good person, a God-fearing man.
He knows a God-fearing man when he sees him?
Yes.
There you go.
He's full of understanding.
Okay. Yes.
Even self-preservation as well, God is protecting him, superstitious like you said. If
Yeah.
you keep him alive, well, you have a better chance he will stay alive.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
At one point, the centurion's child was healed.
Yeah, that's actually.
Before this, and I'm just saying, so the Paul following the Christ that healed that child. I'm just saying there might be some inner inquiry about it.
First, go back to where they set sail from. They set sail from Caesarea. The trials were held in Caesarea. Okay? The trials surrounding Paul were no doubt the talk of the town. Do you understand? All that Paul had said and done was available for. Now, again, this is conjecture. I'm not saying this is in there. I'm just saying when I went back and thought about it, I thought, he probably was well aware of who he was hauling, because at their first port of call, he was willing to let him go visit friends. He knew that this guy was okay. He knew that this guy was okay. Maybe he had heard some of that talk that went on. Who knows? But he knew that this guy was okay. And yes, there's all kinds of reasons why he would let him, why he would want to keep him alive. All kinds of reasons. All those that you've mentioned. What?
Well, going along with what you just said, he recognized he wasn't a criminal.
Right.
It wasn't like I'm letting a murderer go
Right.
on the streets.
Right. Yes.
I think too, he's a commander. He knows the confidence of a commander. He he knows the competence of a superior commander, and who is actually leading Paul is a superior commander.
Good point.
And the evidence of that is what made him go, there's something different about
Yeah,
this.
yeah.
It goes back to that peace that passes all understanding.
Right.
In the midst of all this, I'm even scared, but this guy is not.
Right.
I mean, he's actually making bold statements that
Right.
no one could make without that could have that kind of knowledge.
Right.
No one will die. I mean, come on.
Obviously,
How do
this
you
guy
know that?
knows the commanding officer.
And he's been preaching the whole time about my God, my God, my God. I mean,
Yeah.
it's
Okay? So what happens when the storm is over? You eat. You make for land when you're given the opportunity. You continue on your journey. I mean, we need to remember that Paul was on his way to Rome. He's been on his way to Rome for a long time now. He went to Rome by way of Jerusalem. Even when they told him not to go to Jerusalem, he was going to Rome by way of Jerusalem. So he's been on his way. So what did Paul do? Kept on going. And finally stayed on course. Stayed on course. Even when the ship was off course, Paul was on course. If you have your books and you want to fill in some blanks, God's plan in human action. Let's see how you do filling them in. God's blank over all of life encompasses the free actions of human beings in ways we are unable to comprehend fully. The Lord's plan goes forward through the blank of human beings and as moral agents. Knowing that God is working blank all the...
All.
Yeah, all. Knowing that God is working all things for the good of those who love Him. We trust in His promise to fulfill His plan even when we do not understand our present circumstances. God's what?
Control.
His what?
Control.
Control, will,
Power.
power, provision. Okay? And what's the next one? Through the what of human beings?
Service, action, lives.
Action, serves, what? Lives, what? Yes. Okay. God's sovereignty through the choices of human beings. You see, folks, what happens is this. We live our lives. We live our lives seeking to honor God. We live our lives seeking to honor God. We don't always do that. We don't always do that. But God remains faithful. God always remains faithful even when we are faithless. God always remains faithful, and we can always trust Him. Especially in the storms of life and when it seems like all is lost, when everything is washed away. In the midst of the storm, God is there. In the midst of all of these disasters that have befallen, oh my goodness, the tornadoes that were coming through, Friday night, there were people who died. I mean, people injured. Come on. In the midst of that, people will say, where was God? God was there. God was there. And you say, yeah, well, He wasn't with that lady who died. Yes, God was there. God is there always through all of the storms of life. And we tend to forget it when the storms come because we're so focused on the storms, we forget to look at God. And I've got news for you, boys and girls. Sometimes God sends you into the storm. See, a lot of people, a lot of theologians have speculated that perhaps Paul was outside of the will of God, and that's why he met up with the storm. And a lot of times we do that, don't we? We think we're doing something the right way, and things don't go well, and you start questioning, saying, well, I wonder if God really wanted me to do this. Well, if you were prayed up at the beginning, and you made the decision that God's with you. I got news for you about something else. God's with you even when you make a mistake. This is crazy, but You start off and you do something. And you think you know what God's telling you to do. He'll stop you or he'll let you go. He'll stop you or he'll let you go. If he lets you go, he's saying, that's really not what I had in mind, but let's make it work. Let's make it work.
Well, you know, the people that died in the storm, that was their time to go.
Yeah. There you go.
That was God's will.
But guys, I think that God sent Paul into the storm. Paul was saying, there's a storm coming. There's a storm coming. I know there's a storm coming. Think about this. Do you remember a time? Do you remember a time when Jesus sent his disciples on a boat out into the Sea of Galilee? He said, y'all go on ahead, I'll catch up later. Y'all go on ahead. I mean, that's what he said. Y'all go on ahead, I'll catch up later. You can't tell me that God incarnate did not know that there was a storm brewing. Sent them right into that storm. And then came out to us and said, what are y'all so scared about? It's just a storm. Let's pray. Father, we thank you that in the midst of the storm, you're there. In whatever storms this life brings on, you are there. You are walking with us, strengthening us, teaching us, living through us, using us as examples of what it's like to walk in faith. Father, may we always trust you because you are always trustworthy. And we thank you for that and pray that we will walk in that as we leave this place. I pray in Jesus' name.